For the first 3 years of World War I, the United States was able to avoid involvement in the war. Unfortunately, that changed around 1917. There were several events that caused the United States to become involved in the war. Today we're going to look at those events. One of the biggest blows to the Allied forces was when Russia pulled its troops from the war. Support dwindled quickly in Russia. One thing, it was just a large number of casualties on the battlefield on the Eastern Front. Also, people in Russia were starving to death. They were low on resources. They were low on supplies. They had difficulty feeding both the soldiers and the civilians. Russia was in deep trouble, so they finally pulled out of World War I. And since Russia was a large part of the Allied forces, it made the Allies significantly weaker. And Germany saw this as an opportunity, and they made a push to claim Europe. They made a push towards victory. And if it wouldn't have been for the United States joining, Germany would have probably definitely won the war. There were several factors, as I mentioned earlier, that forced the United States to join the Allies. As I mentioned, our country had tried to stay out of the war. We tried to practice neutrality, and for a while it worked. However, several events finally pushed us in the war. As we mentioned during yesterday's lecture, Germany, after the sinking of the Lusitania, stated that they were going to reduce submarine warfare. They would start offering warnings and allow civilians to get off of ships before they sunk it. However, all that changed in February of 1917. Germany announced that it would go back to submarine warfare. They would start sinking battleships. And one of the main reasons that Germany did this is because they were trying to make that push for the war. As we mentioned several days ago, there was a stalemate. In other words, neither side was really able to advance. Germany decided to take that strategy and put it into motion. They decided they would begin sinking supply ships without a warning. This move really angered President Wilson. It was kind of the final straw. He denounced Germany, meaning he spoke out against them. He was condemning their actions. The steps that Germany was taking were basically atrocities. They'd already killed close to 1,200 civilians when they sank the Lusitania. President Wilson had finally had enough of Germany, so he steps up and speaks out against Germany's actions. And President Wilson doesn't really look like he was probably the nicest or happiest guy anyway. So, as I mentioned earlier, he was angry. I think he finally realized that the United States was going to have to step in and help the Allied forces. The second factor that was kind of you hear the phrase, the straw that broke the camel's back. The thing that finally made the United States realize that we needed to enter the war was the discovery of the Zimmerman note. And this was in early 1917. The Zimmerman note was I think it helped the U.S. realize that Germany was definitely a threat. They had plans outside of Europe. Now, the Zimmerman note was basically a letter that Germany's foreign minister, Arthur Zimmerman, had sent to Mexico. Now, a foreign minister is someone that works for your country. They reach out to other nations and try to establish relationships. This message was intercepted by the British. Now, the British were part of the Allied forces. They were an ally to the United States. We had a good relationship with the British. And this was a huge discovery that would change the course of the war and really change history. It's going to finally get the United States involved. I can't emphasize that enough, that it will get the United States involved in World War I. When the Zimmerman note was discovered by the British, this is what it actually looked like. This is an actual copy of the Zimmerman note. They call it a note or a letter, but it was basically a coded message. You could see a pattern of numbers. Now, someone who was very intelligent that worked for the British government was able to figure some sort of pattern out in the code. The German ambassador I don't have a clue how they did it. Was someone they were able to read this message in Mexico and take the code and actually come up with the meaning of the message. I don't have a clue how they did it, intended for someone else. Fascinating. Britain, but this was a big development. Received the message, and here is basically the message was to try to get Mexico involved on Germany's side. And Germany had a very interesting proposal for Mexico. And we're fixing to go into that. Now, the Zimmerman note basically offered Mexico the ability to take back some territory that they had had to give up to the United States. In previous wars and previous unequal deals between Mexico and the U.S., the United States gained a sizable amount of territory. For example, New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. Zimmerman basically promised that if Mexico would join Germany's side against the United States, they would help them reconquer the lost territory. After everything's over, Germany's assuming that they're going to have this help from Mexico and they're going to be able to make war with the U.S. They're going to defeat Britain and defeat the U.S. They're going to give Mexico territory back in the United States. Now, if you ever looked at a map of the United States, I would hope you would understand that Mexico is very close. They're right below us. So the thought of a country that close to us becoming involved with the Central Powers, with Germany and Austria-Hungary during the war, it's a scary thought. I imagine it finally pushed us into action. Britain finally revealed the note to the United States government. Now, I imagine Britain, nobody's really talked about it, but this was probably a good thing to Britain. They probably realized that they finally were going to be able to get the United States on their side. This was probably a big help to Britain. Now, the U.S. was kind of divided. Some people thought we should stay out of the war. Some people believe we should enter. When this note went public, when everybody in America found out about it, it was go time. The anti-German feelings went up in the United States. Everyone was angry with Germany. They hated Germany because Germany had plans to give part of America's territory back to Mexico. So finally, on April 30th, President Wilson went before Congress and he asked Congress to declare war on Germany. Because to actually declare war, the president has to have authorization. In President Wilson's speech, he made it clear that the U.S., you know, it was a just war. There was cause for us to enter the war. We were needed to help stop Germany. It wasn't a case of imperialism where we were going to try to take over another land and establish colonies. He actually had the view that the war, even though it was bad, war's terrible, it would actually make the world safe for democracy, and it would be a war to end future wars. He realized that there was going to be consequences for joining the war. We would lose people, and that it would be costly. But he felt that it was very important that we enter this war to spread democracy around the world. Now, as soon as the U.S. entered the war, he gets authorization. It wasn't like we just packed up the next day and headed to Europe. We had to have time to recruit people. We needed millions of soldiers. We had to draft soldiers to fight. We had to then train those soldiers and supply the soldiers. The big part was also transporting a modern army across the Atlantic. This was a huge undertaking. But, as we talked about total war in yesterday's lecture, that was what the U.S. embarked on. And it was successful. We were able to recruit, train, supply, and transport large numbers of soldiers across the Atlantic. And within no time, there were close to 2 million soldiers fighting on the Western Front. As we had mentioned earlier, Russia had pulled out at a bad time. The Allied forces took a great hit, and it weakened the Allied forces. You have to imagine what it's like to be a soldier from maybe somewhere like Italy or Britain or France, and your morale's down. You worry about the war, you feel that you're fighting for a lost cause, and then all of a sudden you see millions of new troops show up and they're on your side. These new troops are trained, they're in good spirits, and they're ready to fight. It was a big morale boost for the Allied troops, and it was a great thing for the Allied forces. It put the Allies on the path to victory. Now, another big thing that happened as a result of the U.S. entering the war and joining the side of the Allies, there were financial benefits for the Allied forces. The Allies were in great debt. Countries like Britain and France and Italy, they were having to borrow large sums of money to pay for the war effort. They were probably close to having to quit the war, give up and allow Germany to be the victor, because war is expensive. It takes a large amount of your resources. But we provided a big boost, both numbers and finances. Now, Wilson, he was in an interesting place in his presidency. He had tried to be neutral. He wanted to keep the U.S. out of the war, as we mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. However, he was unable to do that. He failed to maintain neutrality. However, he still wanted to be a peacemaker. And the whole time that Wilson was, getting the U.S. involved in this war and asking for permission to declare war on Germany, he had ideas for peace. Now, in January of 1918, Wilson issued something called the 14 Points. Now, most of you are going to be happy to know we're not going to go into all 14. However, there's a few key things you have to understand about the 14 points, because this is a big thing. It's going to set us on a path for the next 20 or 30 years in our history where we're going to be involved in another war. But basically, Wilson wanted a way to resolve World War I and future wars, and these were several of the things he wanted. He wanted freedom of the seas. He felt that a country should be able to transport their goods safely and not have to worry about being bombed by a U-boat. He also wanted free trade. He wanted nations all around the world to be able to trade without issue. He also wanted nations to reduce their arms. As we learned, I believe it was Wednesday night or Tuesday night, weaponry had really advanced during World War I.